What happens when a Coast Guard officer humiliates an elderly veteran for a simple boat ride? The name he reveals next leaves everyone speechless. The Gulf of Mexico shimmered under the late afternoon sun, its surface a mosaic of gold and turquoise as it stretched toward the horizon off Apalachicola, Florida. The Gulf Whisper, a weathered 38-foot fishing boat, cut through the gentle swells, its hull creaking with the weight of decades spent battling storms and tides. At the helm stood Harlan Jessup, a man whose 78 years had carved deep lines into his face, each one a silent testament to a life of grit and sacrifice. His hands, gnarled yet steady, gripped the salt-worn wheel, guiding the boat toward a quiet cove near St. George Island. Harlan's faded denim jacket hung loose on his broad frame, and his eyes, sharp despite their age, scanned the water with the instinct of a man who'd spent more years at sea than on land. Today wasn't about fishing, though. Harlan had a different purpose, one rooted in a quiet act of kindness that had become his way of giving back to a world that often overlooked him. That morning he'd been at the Apalachicola Community Center on Bay Avenue, dropping off a cardboard box filled with canned beans, tuna, and peaches for the local food drive. The center's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as volunteers sorted donations, their voices mingling with the clatter of tin cans. Harlan had kept to himself, as usual, nodding politely to the organizer, Mrs. Dolores Hinton, a wiry woman with a clipboard and a no-nonsense smile. He'd been about to leave when he overheard a conversation that stopped him in his tracks. Marisol Vargas, a young mother with tired eyes and a worn purse slung over her shoulder, was talking to another volunteer. Her voice was soft, tinged with worry. "Diego's turning 9 tomorrow," she said, "and I want it to be special. But things are tight. He loves boats, keeps drawing them in his sketchbook. But we've never been on one." Her words carried the weight of a parent desperate to give her child a moment of joy, despite life's relentless grind. Harlan, standing near the door, paused. He didn't know Marisol well, just enough to recognize her from the diner on Commerce Street where she waited tables. But her words stirred something in him. He'd seen too many kids grow up without a single day to call their own, and something about Diego's love for boats hit a nerve. Without overthinking it, he approached her, his boots scuffing the linoleum floor. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "But if it's a boat ride your boy wants, I can take you both out tomorrow. No charge. Just a short trip to the cove." Marisol's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and suspicion. "Oh, Mr. Jessup, that's kind, but we couldn't impose." "No imposition," Harlan said, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Got a boat that's been sitting too long. Be good to give her a run." After a moment's hesitation, Marisol's face softened, and she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Jessup. Diego will be over the moon." Now, as the Gulf Whisper chugged toward the cove, Diego sat on a bench near the bow, his small hands clutching an oversized orange life jacket. His dark eyes sparkled with excitement, darting between the water and Harlan. "Mr. Jessup, do dolphins really jump like in the movies?" he asked, his voice barely carrying over the rumble of the old diesel engine. Harlan glanced over, his lips twitching into a grin. "They do, kid. Higher than you'd believe. Keep watching. They like to show off when the sun's low like this." Marisol, seated beside her son, smoothed her skirt nervously, her gaze flickering between Diego's joy and the vast expanse of water. "You're too kind, Harlan," she said softly. "This is more than I could have hoped for." Harlan waved it off, his eyes back on the horizon. "Ain't about me, Marisol. Every kid ought to have a day that sticks with him." The moment felt right, the kind of quiet good that Harlan had learned to cherish in his later years. He'd seen enough of the world's ugliness to know these moments were rare, simple, untainted by the cynicism that seemed to seep into everything else. But as the Gulf Whisper neared the cove, a sharp whine sliced through the calm, shattering the peace like glass. A Coast Guard cutter, its gray hull gleaming with official purpose, cut through the water at speed, its red stripe a stark warning of authority. Harlan's stomach tightened, an old instinct kicking in. He'd navigated these waters since he was younger than Diego, and he knew the Coast Guard didn't move that fast for a friendly chat. The cutter slowed, its wake rocking the Gulf Whisper hard enough to make Diego grab the bench. Ensign Trevor Hollis, a young officer with a chiseled jaw and a swagger that screamed inexperience, leaned over the rail, megaphone in hand. His voice crackled with impatience, amplified to a near shout. "This is the United States Coast Guard, vessel Gulf Whisper. Cut your engine and prepare to be boarded for inspection." Harlan's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening on the wheel. He eased the throttle back, the boat slowing to an idle as the swells slapped against the hull. "Inspection?" he muttered under his breath, his mind racing. He glanced at Marisol and Diego, who looked confused, their earlier joy replaced by uncertainty. "Stay calm," he told them, his voice low but steady. "This is just routine. Nothing to fret over." But Harlan knew better. The cutter's speed, the edge in Hollis's voice. It wasn't routine. Something was off, and he'd learned long ago to trust his gut when the air felt wrong. The cutter pulled alongside, its bulk dwarfing the Gulf Whisper. Two officers climbed aboard, their boots thudding against the deck. Hollis led, his posture radiating self-assurance, while Petty Officer Lena Caldwell followed, her face neutral, but her eyes scanning every inch of the boat, like a predator sizing up prey. "Name and registration," Hollis demanded, his tone sharp, as if he'd already decided Harlan was guilty of something. He stood with his hands on his hips, his Coast Guard uniform crisp against the faded wood of the Gulf Whisper. "Harlan Jessup," Harlan replied, his voice even but laced with a quiet defiance. He reached into a weathered folder tucked beside the helm, pulling out the boat's registration papers. "All in order. Been that way for 50 years. Hollis snatched the papers, barely glancing at them before tossing them onto the console. "This boat looks like it's one storm away from sinking, old man. You sure it's even legal to be out here?" Harlan's eyes narrowed, but he kept his composure. He'd dealt with men like Hollis before. Young, full of themselves, itching to prove their power. "She's weathered worse than you can dream up," he said, his tone calm but pointed. "Carried me through hurricanes and wars. She'll outlast us both." Diego, still clutching his life jacket, piped up, his voice small but eager. "Mr. Jessup's boat is the best. He's taking us to see dolphins for my birthday." Hollis shot the boy a dismissive glance, his lips curling into a smirk. "Kid, pipe down. This isn't a game." He turned back to Harlan, raising his voice as if speaking to someone half-deaf. "We got a tip about illegal fishing in this sector. You got nets, traps, anything you shouldn't?" Marisol's face paled, her hands tightening around Diego's shoulders. Harlan met Hollis's gaze, unflinching. "No nets, no traps. Just a man taking a mother and her boy for a ride. You're barking up the wrong tree." Hollis scoffed, exchanging a look with Caldwell, who was already poking around the deck, her flashlight sweeping over the worn planks. "A ride, huh? Looks more like an unlicensed charter to me. You got a permit for passengers, Jessup?" Harlan's patience was wearing thin, but he kept his voice steady. "I ain't charging them a dime. This is a favor, plain and simple. You want to check my soul for permits, too?" Caldwell paused, glancing at Hollis. "He's right, sir. No evidence of commercial activity, just fishing rods and personal gear." Hollis ignored her, his eyes locked on Harlan. "Don't get smart with me. We're checking below. Step aside." Harlan hesitated, his fingers twitching against the wheel. He wasn't hiding anything, never had. But the way Hollis was strutting, treating him like some two-bit smuggler, stirred a fire in his chest. He'd faced worse than this in his life, far worse, but the disrespect cut deep, especially with Marisol and Diego watching. Still, he stepped back, gesturing to the hatch. "Go on then, waste your time." Caldwell descended into the small cabin, her boots echoing in the cramped space. Hollis kept his eyes on Harlan, his smirk growing. "You know, boats like this are always trouble. Old guys like you think you own the water, but the rules don't bend for anybody. Harlan's gaze hardened, but he bit back the retort burning in his throat. He'd learned long ago that words didn't win fights like this. Patience did. Marisol, sensing the tension, pulled Diego closer, her voice barely a whisper. "Harlan, are we in trouble?" "No, ma'am," Harlan said, his eyes never leaving Hollis. "Just a young fellow with too much badge and not enough sense." Hollis's face reddened, but before he could snap back, Caldwell emerged, holding a small, rusted metal box Harlan kept under the bunk. "Found this," she said, shaking it lightly. A faint rattle came from inside, like the sound of memories long buried. "Personal effects," Harlan said curtly, his voice carrying a warning. "Nothing you need to bother with?" "Open it," Hollis ordered, stepping closer, his tone dripping with authority. Harlan's hands clenched, but he took the box, his fingers brushing the familiar dents and scratches. He flipped the latch, revealing a handful of faded photographs, a tarnished pocket watch, and a small worn medal, a bronze star, its ribbon frayed but still proud. The sight of it hit him like a wave, memories of fire and blood flashing through his mind. He pushed them down, closing the box with deliberate care. Hollis glanced at the contents, unimpressed. "Old junk. Doesn't mean you're clean." Marisol's eyes lingered on the medal, a flicker of recognition in her gaze. She'd grown up hearing stories of soldiers, her father's tales of Vietnam echoing in her mind. But she stayed silent, her hands trembling slightly. Diego, however, couldn't hold back. "Is that a hero medal?" he asked, his voice small but filled with awe. Hollis laughed, a short barking sound that grated on Harlan's nerves. "Kid, don't get your hopes up. Plenty of folks have trinkets like that. Doesn't make 'em special." Harlan's face remained stone, but his eyes burned with a quiet fury. He set the box down, his movement slow, deliberate. "You done here?" he asked, his voice low, almost a growl. "Not even close," Hollis snapped. "We're impounding this boat until we confirm your story. You'll follow us to the station. Now." Marisol gasped, her voice breaking. "Impounding? He's just taking us for a ride. It's Diego's birthday, for God's sake." Hollis shrugged, unmoved. "Rules are rules, lady. If he's clean, he'll be fine. Eventually." Harlan's hands balled into fists, but he forced them to relax. He'd promised Diego a day to remember, and now it was spiraling into a nightmare. The boy's wide, frightened eyes and Marisol's shaking hands made it personal, a wound deeper than Hollis's petty power trip. Harlan had faced men with guns, not just badges, and he'd come out standing. But this was different. It wasn't just about him. "Fine," Harlan said, his voice cold as the steel in his spine. "Lead the way." The cutter towed the Gulf Whisper toward the Coast Guard station on Water Street, its docks bustling with activity as the last light of day faded. A crowd had gathered. Locals, fishermen, a few curious tourists, drawn by the sight of the cutter hauling in an old fishing boat. Whispers spread like ripples. "That's Harlan Jessup's boat. What did he do?" Inside the station, Hollis led them to a cramped office, its walls lined with faded nautical charts and a flickering computer screen. Petty Officer Jamal Kendrick, a stocky man with a no-nonsense demeanor, looked up from his desk. "What's this about, Hollis?" "Possible unlicensed charter," Hollis said, tossing Harlan's papers onto the desk. "Maybe illegal fishing, too. Boat's a wreck, and this guy's acting cagey." "I ain't cagey," Harlan said, his voice steady but laced with irritation. "I told you what I'm doing. You just ain't listening." Kendrick raised an eyebrow, glancing from Hollis to Harlan. "ID, please, sir." Harlan pulled out his worn wallet, handing over his driver's license with a slow, deliberate motion. Kendrick typed the information into the system, his eyes narrowing as the screen loaded. He paused, leaning closer, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Mr. Jessup," he said, his tone shifting, "you've got no violations. But the boat's flagged for a maintenance check. You'll need to wait while we sort this out." Hollis smirked, leaning against the wall. Told you. Rules don't care who you are. Harlan met his gaze, unflinching. I've followed rules my whole life, son. More than you'll ever know. The room fell silent, the weight of Harlan's words hanging heavy. Marisol shifted uncomfortably, whispering to Diego to stay quiet. The boy's eyes darted between the adults, sensing something bigger was at play. Outside, the crowd grew, their murmurs carrying through the open window. Otis Randall, a grizzled fisherman who'd shared beers with Harlan at the Rusty Anchor, pushed through, his face creased with concern. "What's going on here?" he called, his voice rough but loud. Hollis stepped outside, waving him off. "Nothing to see, folks, just a routine check." But Otis wasn't convinced. He caught Harlan's eye through the window, and the old man's steady gaze told him this was far from routine. Harlan's face, weathered and unyielding, held a story no one had bothered to ask about. Until now. The Apalachicola Coast Guard station on Water Street hummed with the sterile buzz of fluorescent lights, their cold glow casting stark shadows across the linoleum floor. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and engine oil, carried in from the docks just beyond the office's thin walls. Harlan Jessup sat in a hard plastic chair, his broad shoulders squared despite the weight of 78 years. His hands, calloused from decades at sea, rested in his lap, fingers interlaced with a deliberate calm that masked the storm brewing inside him. Across the room, Ensign Trevor Hollis paced, his polished boots clicking with each step, his impatience radiating like heat off asphalt. Marisol Vargas sat beside her son Diego, her fingers twisting the hem of her faded blouse, her dark eyes darting nervously between Harlan and the officers. Diego, his earlier excitement drowned by the tension, clutched his orange life jacket, his small frame hunched as if trying to disappear. Petty Officer Jamal Kendrick sat at a battered metal desk, his fingers hovering over a keyboard as he scrolled through records on a flickering computer screen. The monitor's pale light illuminated his face, revealing a furrowed brow and a hint of unease. Every so often his eyes flicked toward Harlan, as if the old man's steady silence carried a weight he couldn't quite place. The office, cramped with nautical charts pinned to the walls and a cluttered bulletin board of Coast Guard memos, felt smaller with each passing minute, the tension coiling tighter like a rope under strain. Hollis stopped pacing, planting himself in front of Harlan, his arms crossed. "You're too calm for someone in your position, Jessup," he said, his voice sharp, dripping with suspicion. "Most people would be begging to explain themselves by now. What are you hiding?" Harlan's eyes, sharp and unyielding despite the lines etched around them, met Hollis's. "I ain't hiding a thing," he said, his voice low, gravelly, carrying the weight of a man who'd faced worse than a puffed-up ensign. "I told you my story. You're the one making it complicated." Hollis's face reddened, his jaw tightening. "Don't get cute with me, old man. You're sitting here because your boat's a floating junkyard, and I don't buy this birthday ride nonsense." He leaned closer, his voice rising, as if volume could mask his insecurity. "You think you can just sail around, ignoring regulations, because you're old? Rules don't bend for you." Marisol's breath caught, her hands tightening around Diego's shoulders. "Please, officer," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "He's telling the truth. It's my son's birthday. Mr. Jessup was just being kind." Hollis turned on her, his eyes narrowing. "Ma'am, I don't need your input. You and your kid shouldn't be out there with some geezer in a boat that's one wave away from sinking." Harlan's hands twitched in his lap, his knuckles whitening. The word geezer landed like a slap, not because it hurt his pride, but because it dismissed everything he'd endured. Years of service, sacrifice, and survival reduced to a cheap insult. He'd faced mortars and monsoons, carried men through hell, and buried friends. Yet here was this kid, barely old enough to shave, strutting like he owned the world. Harlan's voice stayed steady, but there was a bite to it now, a quiet edge honed by experience. "You might want to watch how you talk to her, son. She's got more courage in her little finger than you've shown all day." Hollis froze, caught off guard by the steel in Harlan's tone. The room went quiet, the hum of the lights suddenly deafening. Diego looked up at Harlan, his eyes wide, a mix of fear and admiration. Marisol's lips parted, but she said nothing, her gratitude unspoken, but clear in her gaze. Outside, the crowd on the dock had swelled, their murmurs carrying through the open window like a distant tide. Otis Randall, the grizzled fisherman who'd known Harlan for decades, stood at the front, his weathered hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. Beside him was Tessa Monroe, the bartender from the Rusty Anchor on Market Street, her auburn hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She'd seen Harlan slip 20s to struggling families at the bar, never asking for recognition, and the sight of him being hauled in like a criminal set her blood boiling. "This is a damn disgrace," she muttered to Otis, her voice low but fierce. "Harlan's the last person who'd break a rule." Otis nodded, his jaw tight. "Hollis is out of his depth. I've seen Harlan weather storms that'd send that boy running for shore." Back in the office, Petty Officer Lena Caldwell returned from inspecting the Gulf Whisper, her clipboard tucked under her arm. Her face was unreadable, but her posture suggested a weariness with Hollis's theatrics. "Boat's clean," she said, her voice flat. "No illegal gear, no contraband. Just some old rods, a tackle box, and that metal case we found." Hollis's eyes narrowed, his frustration palpable. "You sure you checked every inch? Boats like that always hide something." Caldwell's jaw tightened, her patience fraying. "I know how to do my job, Ensign. There's nothing out of place." Harlan leaned back in his chair, his expression unchanged, but a faint spark of satisfaction flickered in his eyes. He'd known they'd find nothing. His life was an open book, weathered but honest. "Told you," he said, his voice calm but laced with a dry humor. "Unless you think my fishing rods are smuggling secrets." Hollis ignored the jab, turning to Kendrick. "Run his name again. Something's off. Nobody's this calm unless they're hiding something big." Kendrick sighed, his fingers tapping the keyboard with reluctance. He'd already sensed this wasn't as simple as Hollis wanted it to be. The screen flickered, and his eyes widened as he scrolled through a file that stretched longer than he'd expected. He leaned closer, his breath catching as he read. "Mr. Jessup," he said, his tone softer now, almost reverent. "You served in the Navy, didn't you?" Harlan nodded once, his gaze steady. "Long time ago. Before you were born, I reckon." Hollis rolled his eyes, crossing his arms. "Great, another old sailor with a story. Doesn't mean he's above the law." Kendrick's jaw tightened, but he kept his focus on the screen. He printed out a sheet and handed it to Hollis, his voice firm. "Read this. Carefully." Hollis skimmed the paper, his smirk fading for a moment before he tossed it back onto the desk. "So he was in the Navy. Big deal. Doesn't give him a free pass to run a sketchy boat." Diego, who'd been silent, suddenly spoke up, his voice small but defiant. "Mr. Jessup's a hero! He's got a medal in that box!" Hollis turned on the boy, his patience gone. "Kid, stay out of this. You don't know what you're talking about." Marisol's face flushed with anger, her voice rising. "Don't you dare speak to my son like that. He's done nothing wrong, and neither has Mr. Jessup." Hollis stepped closer, looming over her. "Ma'am, I'm warning you. Keep quiet, or you'll make this worse." "Enough," Harlan said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife through canvas. He stood slowly, his frame still imposing despite his age, and the air seemed to shift around him. His eyes locked on Hollis, unyielding, carrying a quiet authority that made the younger man falter. "You've got a problem with me. Fine. But you leave her and the boy out of it. They're not your punching bag." Hollis froze, his confidence cracking like thin ice. For a moment no one spoke, the tension so thick it seemed to choke the room. Kendrick, still at the computer, looked up, his expression shifting to something close to respect. He'd seen something in Harlan's file, something Hollis had missed. The office door swung open, and a new figure stepped in, his presence commanding immediate attention. Vernon Tate, A retired Navy officer in his mid-50s stood tall in civilian clothes, a pressed flannel shirt and jeans, but his posture screamed military discipline. His salt-and-pepper hair was cropped short, and his eyes, sharp and assessing, scanned the room before settling on Harlan. Vernon had been at the dock, talking to Otis about the day's catch, when he'd heard Harlan's name. He'd known Harlan years ago, shared stories over coffee at the Rusty Anchor, and the news of his detention had pulled him here like a magnet. "What in the hell is going on here?" Vernon demanded, his voice calm but carrying an edge that silenced the room. His gaze flicked to Hollis, then to Harlan, a flicker of recognition passing between the two men. Hollis straightened, but his voice wavered. "Routine inspection, sir. This man's boat was flagged for possible unlicensed activity." Vernon's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Routine, huh? Looks more like you're hassling a man who's done nothing but try to do right by a kid." Kendrick stood, sensing the shift in the room. "Mr. Tate, we've got this under control." "Do you?" Vernon cut him off, his tone sharp but controlled. "Because from where I'm standing, you're making a damn fool of yourself, and you don't even know it." Hollis bristled, his face reddening. "With all due respect, sir, you don't have authority here." Vernon stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. "Maybe not, Ensign. But I know Harlan Jessup, and I know you're about to regret this." The room fell silent, the weight of Vernon's words sinking in. Harlan said nothing, his face a mask of stoic resolve, but his eyes met Vernon's for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement of a shared past. Marisol and Diego watched, confused, but clinging to a spark of hope. Outside, the crowd pressed closer to the windows, their murmurs growing louder as Tessa and Otis exchanged worried glances. Hollis, refusing to back down, doubled down. "We're taking the boat to the impound lot. Procedure's procedure, and I don't care who he knows." Vernon's gaze didn't waver. "Check that file again, son. Before you make a mistake, you can't undo." Kendrick hesitated, then returned to the computer, his fingers moving quickly. His eyes widened as he read further, his breath catching. He looked at Harlan, then at Hollis, his voice low. "Ensign, you need to see this." Hollis leaned over, his scowl deepening as he scanned the screen. His face paled, but he quickly masked it, his voice defiant. "Doesn't change a thing. He's coming with us." Harlan stood, his movement slow but deliberate, his eyes burning with a quiet fire. "I'll go where you need me to go," he said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of a man who'd faced worse odds and walked away. "But you're digging a hole, and you'll find out soon enough how deep it goes." The crowd outside erupted in murmurs as Harlan, Marisol, and Diego were escorted toward the impound area. Tessa's voice rose above the noise, sharp and indignant. "This is bullshit, Hollis. Harlan's one of us." Otis echoed her, his fists clenched, drawing nods from the others. As they reached the dock, a low rumble echoed in the distance. A helicopter, its blade slicing through the humid air. It was too far to see clearly, but its presence sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Hollis glanced at it, then at Harlan, his confidence faltering for the first time. Harlan's face remained unreadable, but his eyes followed the chopper's path, a faint spark of recognition in their depths. The Apalachicola Coast Guard Station stood bathed in the fading light of dusk, its squat building on Water Street casting long shadows across the bustling dock. The air was thick with the tang of salt and diesel, the Gulf of Mexico's restless waves slapping against the pilings. Harlan Jessup stood near the impounded Gulf Whisper, his weathered hands tucked into the pockets of his faded denim jacket, his face a mask of quiet resolve. At 78, his broad shoulders still carried the strength of a younger man, but it was his eyes, sharp, unyielding, etched with decades of trials, that held the weight of his story. Marisol Vargas and her son Diego stood close by, the boy's small hand clutching his mother's, his earlier excitement replaced by a nervous awe as he sensed the gravity of the moment. The crowd of locals, fishermen, shopkeepers, and dock workers, pressed against the chain-link fence, their murmurs rising like a tide, drawn by the unfolding drama. Ensign Trevor Hollis, his crisp Coast Guard uniform now slightly rumpled, barked orders to Petty Officer Lena Caldwell, directing her to secure the Gulf Whispers lines. His voice, once brimming with arrogance, now carried a faint tremor, as if he sensed the ground shifting beneath him. Petty Officer Jamal Kendrick lingered near the office door, his stocky frame tense, his eyes darting between Harlan and the horizon, where a helicopter's rumble grew louder, its blade slicing through the humid air. The chopper's silhouette, dark against the twilight sky, sent a ripple of anticipation through the crowd. Tessa Monroe, the bartender from the Rusty Anchor on Market Street, stood beside Otis Randall, the grizzled fisherman who'd known Harlan for decades. Her auburn hair whipped in the breeze, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. "That's no Coast Guard bird," she whispered to Otis, her voice low but urgent. "What the hell's going on?" Otis's weathered face creased with a mix of worry and intrigue. "I don't know, Tessa, but I'd bet my last dollar it's tied to Harlan. He's got a way of surprising folks." Inside the impound area, Hollis turned to Harlan, his clipboard gripped like a shield. "Don't move, Jessup," he snapped, his voice strained. "We're not done here. You can't just walk away." Harlan's gaze remained steady, his eyes tracing the chopper's approach. He felt the weight of the day pressing on him, the sting of Hollis's disrespect, the frightened faces of Marisol and Diego, the crowd's growing unrest. But he stood tall, his dignity unyielding. He'd faced worse than this, far worse, in jungles and on seas where death was a constant companion. Yet the injustice of this moment, the way a simple act of kindness had been twisted into a spectacle, cut deeper than he'd expected. "I ain't going anywhere," he said, his voice low, gravelly, carrying a quiet defiance. "But you're about to learn something, son, and it won't be kind." Marisol clutched Diego's hand, her voice trembling as she leaned toward Harlan. "What's happening, Mr. Jessup? Why won't they let us go?" Harlan turned to her, his expression softening, a flicker of warmth breaking through his stoic facade. "Don't you worry, Marisol. This'll sort itself out. Just stay close to your boy." Before Hollis could retort, Vernon Tate, the retired Navy officer who'd stormed into the office earlier, stepped forward, his presence commanding silence. His flannel shirt and jeans couldn't hide the military precision in his posture, his salt and pepper hair catching the last rays of sunlight. "Ensign Hollis," Vernon said, his voice calm but laced with an authority that made the younger man flinch. "I told you to confirm Mr. Jessup's identity. You didn't listen. Now you're going to wish you had." Hollis's jaw tightened, his confidence fraying like a worn rope. "I've got his ID," he said, his voice defensive. "Harlan Jessup, no record. What's your point, sir?" Vernon's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. "My point, Ensign, is you're standing on a landmine, and you're too damn stubborn to see it." The helicopter was now close enough to shake the dock, its downdraft sending hats tumbling into the water and whipping Marisol's hair across her face. It touched down on a nearby landing pad, its Navy insignia gleaming under the station's floodlights. The crowd fell silent, their murmurs replaced by a collective intake of breath as the door slid open. A tall man in a crisp Navy uniform stepped out, his graying hair neatly combed, his chest adorned with a cascade of ribbons. Rear Admiral Marcus Drayton, a name that carried weight in every naval port from Norfolk to San Diego, strode toward the impound area, his boots clicking with purpose, his eyes locked on Harlan. Kendrick, who'd been watching from the office, hurried out, his face pale as he saluted. "Admiral Drayton, sir," he said, his voice tight with respect. "What brings you to Apalachicola?" Drayton's gaze never wavered from Harlan, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "An old friend called," he said, his voice warm but resonant, carrying over the crowd. "Said one of my men was being hassled for doing what's right." Hollis froze, his clipboard slipping in his sweaty grip. "Your men, sir?" he stammered, his bravado crumbling like dry sand. Drayton ignored him, closing the distance to Harlan. The two men locked eyes, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause, the years falling away as memories of shared battles flickered between them. "Harlan Jessup," Drayton said, his tone softening. "It's been too damn long." Harlan nodded, a rare crack in his stoic facade revealing a flicker of camaraderie. "Marcus," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Didn't think you'd drag yourself out here for me." The crowd stirred, confusion giving way to awe. Tessa leaned toward Otis, her voice barely audible. "Who the hell is this guy? And how's he know Harlan?" Otis shook his head, his eyes wide. "I knew Harlan was tough, but this is something else." Drayton turned to Hollis, his expression hardening, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Ensign, explain why you've detained a decorated Navy veteran and his guests over a maintenance flag." Hollis's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Sir, we had a tip about illegal activity," he stammered. "The boat was flagged, and we followed protocol." "Protocol?" Kendrick interjected, stepping forward with the printout from Harlan's file, his voice firm but respectful. "Ensign, I told you to read this. It's more than a maintenance check." Drayton took the paper, his eyes scanning it with the precision of a man who'd read countless reports. His jaw tightened, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. He handed it back to Kendrick, his voice low but commanding. "Read it aloud, petty officer. Let everyone hear." Kendrick cleared his throat, his voice steady but tinged with reverence as he addressed the crowd. "Harlan Jessup, Lieutenant Commander, United States Navy, retired. Served in Vietnam, 1968 to 1972. Awarded the Bronze Star for valor during the Battle of Khe Sanh, where he saved 12 men under heavy enemy fire, dragging them to safety despite his own wounds. Received a Purple Heart for injuries sustained in combat. Honorably discharged in 1975 with commendations for courage and leadership." The dock fell silent, the weight of Kendrick's words sinking in like an anchor. Marisol's eyes filled with tears, her hand covering her mouth as she looked at Harlan, seeing him anew. Diego, his small frame trembling with awe, whispered, "You're a real hero, Mr. Jessup." Hollis's clipboard dangled uselessly at his side, his face a mask of shock and shame. I didn't know, sir," he managed, his voice barely audible. Drayton's gaze was unrelenting, his voice cold. "You didn't ask, Ensign. You saw an old man and assumed he was nothing. That's your failure, and it's a damn heavy one." Caldwell, who'd been silent, stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. "Admiral, I take responsibility. I should have pushed back on the approach." Drayton nodded, acknowledging her accountability. "Noted, petty officer. But this ends now." He turned to Harlan, his tone softening, a trace of the old friendship shining through. "You want to press this, Harlan? You've got every right to make this hurt." Harlan shook his head, his voice calm but resolute. "I just want to take these folks home, Marcus. The boy deserves his birthday, not a circus." Drayton's smile returned, warm and genuine. He clapped a hand on Harlan's shoulder, the gesture carrying decades of respect. "Same old Harlan, always putting others first. All right, let's get you out of here." The crowd erupted in cheers, Tessa and Otis leading the applause, their voices hoarse with pride. Marisol hugged Harlan, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "For everything. I didn't know." Harlan patted her shoulder awkwardly, unaccustomed to such displays. "Ain't about me, Marisol. It's about your boy." Diego ran to Harlan, wrapping his arms around his waist, his voice muffled against the old man's jacket. "Can we still see the dolphins, Mr. Jessup?" Harlan chuckled, a low rumbling sound that eased the tension in his chest. He ruffled Diego's hair, his eyes warm. "Soon as they cut my boat loose, kid. Promise." Drayton turned to Hollis, who stood rooted to the spot, his face burning with humiliation. "Release the Gulf Whisper immediately," Drayton ordered, his voice brooking no argument. And Ensign, you'll be hearing from my office. Count on it. Hollis nodded, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, sir. As the crowd continued to cheer, Harlan led Marisol and Diego back to the Gulf Whisper, its weathered hull gleaming under the station's lights. The boat was untied, its lines coiled neatly by a chastened Caldwell. The locals lined the dock, clapping and shouting words of support. Tessa called out, her voice carrying over the noise. "You're a legend, Harlan!" "Always were." Harlan gave a small wave, his face still stoic, but his eyes betraying a flicker of gratitude. As the Gulf Whisper pulled away from the dock, Diego pointed excitedly at the water, where a pod of dolphins leaped in the distance, their fins catching the last glint of twilight. Marisol stood beside Harlan at the helm, her voice soft. "You didn't have to go through all that for us, Mr. Jessup." Harlan kept his eyes on the horizon, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Wasn't about me, Marisol. It was about doing what's right. Always is." The Gulf Whisper chugged toward the cove, its engine a steady hum against the quiet of the night. The crowd on the dock grew smaller, their cheers echoing across the water like a fading hymn. Hollis stood alone, watching the boat disappear, his career now a fragile thread. Kendrick and Caldwell exchanged a glance, both knowing they'd witnessed something rare, a man whose quiet strength had turned the tide. Harlan, at the helm, felt the sea breeze on his face, cool and cleansing. The weight of the day lifted, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. He'd faced worse than Hollis in his time, mortars, monsoons, and men with far darker intent. But today, he'd kept his promise to a boy and his mother. And that was enough. The gulf stretched before him, endless and forgiving. And for the first time in hours, Harlan Jessup felt at peace.